I can't keep pretending. I need a man with ambition.
Is that really what you think? Good evening, sir.
Why did he call you that?
The acquisition is complete. Then tell her who owns it.
Sean Cox was 42, a quiet facilities operations manager who looked more comfortable fixing a broken loading dock than attending a 5-star anniversary dinner. Most people believed he had settled for an ordinary life, while his wife Cora climbed the corporate ladder far beyond him. He still drove a 12-year-old Ford Explorer, packed his own lunch, and repaired his own fence every spring. What nobody knew was that Sean had spent 12 years preparing for a single decision that would quietly reshape an entire company. Then across the candle-lit table, Cora slid a sealed envelope toward him. His fingertips settled on the divorce papers, but he didn't open them. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. And if you love slow-burning stories filled with suspense, unexpected twists, and satisfying endings, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. 15 years earlier, Sean Cox had stood outside the Franklin County Courthouse in downtown Columbus with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around Cora's fingers. They had not owned much. His suit had been rented for the wedding. Her dress had been purchased from a small bridal outlet after 3 weekends of searching for something they could afford. It had not mattered. Sean remembered how Cora laughed that afternoon when rain began falling just as they stepped outside. She had looked at him and said, "If we can survive this weather on our wedding day, we'll survive anything." He believed her. Looking back now, sitting across from the unopened envelope in the restaurant, Sean found it strange how clearly the human mind could preserve a promise while quietly forgetting the thousands of moments that slowly erased it. During their first years together, they rented a small brick townhouse on the northwest side of Columbus near Dublin Road. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand comfortably, and the heating system rattled every November. Sean never complained. Every Saturday morning he drove to the hardware store before sunrise. He fixed leaking faucets, he repainted peeling trim, he replaced broken outlets. When something cost $50 to repair instead of $500 to replace, Sean always chose the repair. Not because he enjoyed saving money, because every dollar had somewhere more important to go. Cora wanted an MBA. She dreamed of leading major commercial development projects across the Midwest. She admired executives who arrived at meetings carrying leather portfolios and flew to Chicago or New York without checking airfare prices. Sean admired her ambition. When she was accepted into Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business Executive program, the tuition exceeded anything they had ever imagined paying. Sean simply picked up additional responsibilities. His official title remained Facilities Operations Manager for Summit Commercial Properties, but he volunteered for emergency maintenance rotations, weekend inspections, and overnight building transitions whenever another manager called in sick. His co-workers joked that Sean practically lived inside office buildings. He laughed with them. No one realized that nearly every overtime check went directly toward Cora's education. Some evenings she arrived home after class exhausted. Sean always had dinner waiting. Sometimes it was grilled chicken with vegetables, sometimes homemade chili, sometimes nothing more than spaghetti because it stretched farther than steak. He never mentioned the extra shifts. He never kept score. When classmates invited spouses to networking receptions, Sean attended wearing the same navy blazer he had owned for almost a decade. The conversations usually followed a familiar pattern. "So, Sean, what do you do?" "I manage facilities." Most people smiled politely. Then they turned back toward Cora. "And you're pursuing executive leadership?" "Yes." "That's impressive." Sean never interrupted. He simply held her coat while she spoke with vice presidents, consultants, and developers whose watches often cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. At first, Cora squeezed his hand afterward and thanked him for coming. Later, she simply assumed he would. Years passed. Promotions arrived. Not for Sean, for Cora. Assistant operations manager became operations manager. Operations manager became senior regional manager. Eventually, she accepted an offer from Sterling Urban Development as regional operations director. The salary nearly doubled. Their home became larger. Their neighborhood became quieter. The cars parked in neighboring driveways became newer every year. Sean's remained the same silver Ford Explorer with over 200,000 miles on the odometer. Whenever friends asked why he never upgraded, he smiled. "This one still gets me where I need to go." The answer embarrassed Cora more than he realized. At dinner parties, conversations changed. Executives discussed investment properties, luxury vacations, private schools, golf memberships, stock portfolios. Sean usually asked someone whether they had tried the smoked brisket. People often mistook his silence for lack of intelligence. He never corrected them. The narrator could see what no one else noticed. Sean rarely entered a conversation without first observing everyone inside it. He listened far more than he spoke. He remembered details, names, dates, promises, contradictions. He had learned long ago that people revealed themselves most honestly when they believed no one important was paying attention. Cora, however, began interpreting silence differently. One evening after another corporate reception, she loosened her heels by the front door and sighed. "You could participate more." Sean looked up from unloading the dishwasher. "I thought everyone else had plenty to say." "They do. You don't have to compete." She shook her head. "That's not what I mean." "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "You don't look interested." Sean smiled gently. "I was." You hardly spoke." "I was listening." She walked upstairs without answering. It was the first conversation that ended with both of them believing different things had been said. Months became years. Cora's business trips increased. Chicago, Indianapolis, Nashville, Pittsburgh. Most lasted 1 or 2 nights. Some stretched into long weekends because the client wanted another meeting. Sean never questioned her schedule, not aloud. Instead, he adjusted his own. He watered the plants, collected the mail, paid the bills, changed the furnace filters, replaced the batteries in smoke detectors. The house remained orderly, whether she was home or not. Then another name entered their conversations. Nathan Holloway. At first, it sounded ordinary. "Nathan thinks the expansion project will close early." Nathan wants everyone in Cincinnati on Thursday." "Nathan says this acquisition could change everything." Sean nodded. Managers often spoke about their supervisors. Nothing unusual. Then the frequency increased. Nathan recommended books. Nathan hosted dinners. Nathan praised Cora during meetings. Nathan believed she deserved another promotion. Sean noticed. He also noticed something else. Whenever Nathan's name appeared, Cora unconsciously smiled before she finished the sentence. The smile lasted less than a second. Most husbands might never have recognized it. Sean did. He remembered when that smile had belonged to him. Still, he said nothing. Not because he was afraid. Because accusations without evidence solved nothing. One rainy Tuesday evening, Cora returned home nearly 2 hours later than expected. "I had dinner with the executive team," she explained while placing her keys on the kitchen counter. Sean nodded. "How was it?" "Busy." "What restaurant?" She answered immediately. "Mitchell's Steakhouse." Sean accepted the answer. The next morning, while organizing paperwork before leaving for work, he noticed a folded expense reimbursement lying partially inside her work bag. It wasn't hidden, probably forgotten. Sean had no intention of reading it. He simply picked it up to place it back inside. Then one line caught his attention. Restaurant name. Name the refectory restaurant and bistro. Not Mitchell's Steakhouse. Different restaurant. Different side of Columbus. Different receipt. He stared at it for several quiet seconds. Then he carefully slid the document back exactly where he had found it. He didn't confront Cora. He didn't accuse her of lying. Instead, he opened a small, locked drawer inside his home office. There were already a few folders inside. Nothing dramatic. Copies of travel schedules, corporate newsletters, calendar printouts, notes written in his own careful handwriting. He placed one more document inside. Then he locked the drawer again. For the first time in 15 years, Sean realized he was no longer collecting memories. He was collecting facts. The reservation had been made nearly 3 months in advance. Sean remembered booking it during his lunch break while sitting alone in his truck outside one of Summit Commercial Properties' warehouse buildings. The hostess at Hyde Park Prime Steakhouse had congratulated him on celebrating 15 years of marriage and suggested requesting a corner table overlooking High Street. "It'll be quieter," she had said. Sean appreciated quiet. He had imagined the evening many times since then. Not because he intended to buy expensive gifts or make dramatic speeches. That had never been his style. He simply wanted one evening without conference calls, business trips, or unfinished conversations. 15 years deserved at least a peaceful dinner. Now, as the soft jazz drifted through the restaurant and crystal glasses reflected the warm amber light above them, he realized peace had never arrived. The envelope still rested between him and Cora. She had pushed it across the table only seconds earlier. Neither of them had touched the bread basket. Their steaks had not yet been served. Only 2 glasses of water stood untouched beside neatly folded linen napkins. Sean finally lifted the envelope. His movements remained slow, measured, almost gentle. He read the front. His name appeared in clean black lettering. Sean Cox. Nothing else. No handwritten message, no anniversary card, no explanation. He slid one finger beneath the flap and carefully removed the documents. The first page confirmed exactly what he already suspected. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Franklin County Domestic Relations Court. Petitioner Cora Elaine Cox. Respondent Sean Douglas Cox. He continued reading. His eyes moved steadily across every paragraph. He never skipped ahead. He never frowned. Years of reviewing contracts, maintenance proposals, and commercial leases had taught him one habit above all others. Read every line. People often hid important things in places they assumed others would ignore. Across the table, Cora watched him. She had rehearsed this conversation for weeks. It showed. Her posture remained straight. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried almost no emotion. "I wanted you to have time to read everything before we talked." Sean nodded without looking up. "I appreciate that." The calmness in his answer caught her off guard. She had expected confusion, maybe anger, perhaps pleading. Instead, Sean turned another page. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Around them, the restaurant continued as though nothing unusual had happened. A waiter poured wine at another table. Someone laughed near the bar. Silverware gently touched porcelain. Life rarely paused simply because one marriage was ending. Sean placed the papers neatly back inside the envelope. Then he looked at Cora for the first time that evening. "When did you decide?" She exhaled quietly. "I've been thinking about it for almost a year." He accepted the answer with a small nod. "And when did you know?" She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "About 3 months ago." 3 months. The same month he had reserved tonight's dinner. Neither of them mentioned the coincidence. Sean folded his hands together. "I assume you've spoken with an attorney." "Yes." "And everything here reflects what you want." "Yes." He nodded again. "No children." She swallowed. "No." "The house, it can be sold." "The retirement acts." "My attorney outlined a proposal." Sean listened without interruption. She had always mistaken silence for weakness. Tonight it was simply attention. Finally, Cora leaned forward. "I don't want this to become ugly." "It doesn't have to." "I think we've become different people." Sean waited. She continued. "You've stayed exactly where you were 15 years ago." The words were carefully chosen. Not cruel, simply polished. "You've never wanted more." Sean tilted his head slightly. "What makes you think that—" She hesitated. "You've never tried." I see. You've been comfortable. Sean looked around the dining room. Business executives occupied several nearby tables. A family celebrated a birthday in one corner. An elderly couple quietly shared dessert across the room. He returned his attention to Cora. And you haven't? No. I've worked hard. I know. I've built something. I know. I've grown. I know. Each answer remained steady. Each one somehow frustrated her more. She shifted in her chair. I need someone who understands where my life is going, Sean asked quietly. And I don't. She looked away. You wouldn't be happy in that world. What world? The one I'm in now. The corporate world, Yes. The dinners. The travel. The responsibilities. Sean smiled, almost imperceptibly. You don't think I understand responsibility? I didn't say that. You implied it. She looked toward the restaurant entrance for only a second. A tiny movement, barely noticeable. Sean noticed. He had always noticed. Before he could ask another question, the maitre d' stepped toward the entrance to greet a new group of guests. 4 men entered together. All wore tailored suits. One carried a leather portfolio. Another spoke quietly into a Bluetooth earpiece before slipping it into his pocket. The tallest among them was Nathan Holloway. Even from across the dining room, he projected confidence. Perfect posture, tailored charcoal suit, polished black shoes. The appearance of a man accustomed to boardrooms and private clubs. He laughed at something Richard Lawson had just said. Then his eyes swept casually across the restaurant. They landed on Sean. Everything changed. The smile disappeared first, then the conversation. Nathan stopped walking. Richard took another step before realizing Nathan had frozen. What is it? Richard asked quietly. Nathan didn't answer. His expression shifted from surprise to something much closer to concern. Sean watched him without moving. Cora noticed the interruption. She turned. Her shoulders immediately relaxed. Oh. She offered a polite smile. That's Nathan. Sean already knew. Nathan whispered something to Richard Lawson. Richard's face changed as well. The two exchanged a brief look before both altered direction. Instead of following the hostess toward their private dining room, they walked directly toward Sean's table. Cora smiled nervously. They probably just want to say hello. Sean remained seated. Nathan stopped beside the table. For a brief second, no one spoke. The surrounding conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Servers walked past, carrying steaks on silver trays. The restaurant had no idea that the next few seconds would permanently alter one marriage. Nathan straightened his jacket. His confidence had vanished. In its place stood unmistakable respect. He looked directly at Sean. Good evening. A pause, long enough for Cora to glance between the two men, long enough for Richard Lawson to lower his eyes, long enough for Sean to understand exactly what was about to happen. Then Nathan finished the sentence. Sir. The single words seemed to erase every sound inside the restaurant. Cora blinked. Her smile disappeared. I'm sorry, she said, looking at Nathan with visible confusion. Did you just call my husband, sir? Nathan never took his eyes off Sean. Yes, his voice remained respectful. Because that's exactly how I should address him. Sean slowly folded the divorce papers and placed them back inside the envelope. Then, without the slightest hint of surprise, he rose from his chair. Sean remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. There was no trace of triumph in his expression. If anything, he looked mildly disappointed that the evening had unfolded exactly as he had expected. Nathan Holloway lowered his voice. I sincerely apologize for the interruption, sir. Sean gave a slight nod. Apology accepted. Richard Lawson stepped forward beside Nathan. Although he had led sterling urban development for nearly 2 decades, and negotiated billion-dollar projects across the country, he now waited until Sean acknowledged him before speaking. "Good evening, Mr. Cox." "Good evening, Richard." "It has been too long." "It has." Cora's eyes darted between them. She recognized Richard immediately. Every employee at Sterling did. Richard Lawson wasn't simply another executive. He was the chief executive officer, the highest-ranking executive in the company, the man whose approval determined promotions, acquisitions, and multi-million-dollar developments. And somehow, he was speaking to Sean as though Sean occupied the higher position. "This doesn't make sense," Cora whispered. Richard finally turned toward her. "You must be Mrs. Cox." She nodded automatically. "Yes. It is a pleasure to finally meet you." Her confusion deepened. "You know who I am?" "I've known your name for several months." Sean quietly picked up the envelope containing the divorce papers and slipped it into the inside pocket of his blazer. Nathan noticed the movement. His eyes briefly rested on the envelope before returning to Sean. "I hope we're not arriving at an inconvenient moment." Sean answered calmly. "You are." Nathan's face tightened. "My apologies." Richard glanced toward an empty private dining room near the rear of the restaurant. "Our reservation can wait." Sean looked at him. "It should?" Another awkward silence settled over the table. Nearby diners had begun noticing the unusual scene. Nothing dramatic had happened. No voices had been raised. But people naturally noticed when a restaurant's CEO stopped to greet an apparently ordinary man with unmistakable respect. A waiter approached carrying 2 plates. He hesitated. "Excuse me?" Sean smiled politely. "Please go ahead." The waiter carefully placed the meals before Sean and Cora before quickly leaving. None of the 4 people touched the food. Cora could no longer ignore the questions racing through her mind. "Nathan," her voice sounded unsteady. "What exactly is going on?" Nathan hesitated. He looked toward Sean, not toward Richard, toward Sean, as though asking silent permission. Sean noticed. "So you've become even more careful." Nathan answered quietly. "One learns." Sean almost smiled. Richard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Cox, perhaps tonight isn't the ideal—" "No." She interrupted him. "I think tonight is exactly the right night." She looked directly at Nathan. "You've been my supervisor for 4 years." "Yes." "You've never once called anyone in our company sir unless they were on the board." Nathan remained silent. "You just called my husband sir." Another pause. Then Cora asked the question she never imagined she would have to ask. "Why?" Nathan finally answered. "Because respect should be given where it's earned." The answer only made everything stranger. Sean pulled out his chair and calmly sat back down. He cut a small piece of steak and took his first bite of the evening. Only after swallowing did he speak. "The food will get cold." Neither Nathan nor Richard moved. Cora stared at Sean. "How can you eat right now?" He looked at her peacefully. "Because I skipped lunch." For just a moment, Richard couldn't suppress a small smile. Nathan almost laughed before stopping himself. Cora, however, saw nothing amusing. She leaned forward. "Sean?" "Yes." "Would someone please explain what's happening?" Sean reached for his glass of water. "I believe Richard should." Richard looked surprised. "I should. You've always preferred formal announcements." Richard nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true." He turned toward Cora. "This morning, Sterling Urban Development finalized negotiations with a private investment group." She frowned. "I know." "The executive team has been preparing for months." "Correct." "The acquisition officially closes tomorrow morning." "I know that too," Richard continued. "The acquiring company is Argent Crest Capital." She nodded. "Everyone knows that." Nathan quietly added, "What very few people know is who actually controls Argent Crest." Cora looked back toward Sean, then back toward Nathan, then toward Richard again. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the conversations filling the restaurant. Richard spoke carefully. "Argent Crest Capital does not answer to an investment committee." She frowned. "It doesn't—" "No." "A board?" "No." "Private shareholders?" "No." She shook her head. "Then who owns it?" Neither executive answered immediately. Sean calmly folded his napkin beside his plate. He had imagined this moment many times over the previous several years. Oddly enough, it felt smaller than expected. There was no satisfaction, only inevitability. Richard finally answered. "The controlling owner is seated at this table." The sentence hung in the air. Cora blinked once, then twice. She looked at Sean. No, that couldn't possibly be true. She laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. "That's absurd." No one responded. She looked back at Richard. "You mean he's an investor?" Richard shook his head. "No." "A consultant?" "No." "An advisor?" "No." Nathan answered this time. "Mrs. Cox." His voice remained respectful. "Mr. Sean Cox is the founder and controlling owner of Argent Crest Capital." The words refused to fit together inside her mind. Founder, owner, Argent Crest, Sean. Nothing matched the man she believed she knew. She stared at her husband. "You manage facilities." "I do." "You drive a 12-year-old Ford Explorer." "Yes." "You bring leftovers to work." "I usually do." "You fix things yourself." "I enjoy it." "Then how—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Sean looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "I never lied to you." "You— never—" She searched desperately through years of memories, every birthday, every anniversary, every mortgage payment, every business trip, every ordinary Saturday morning. She couldn't remember a single moment when Sean had ever claimed to be wealthy. Not one. She had simply assumed he wasn't. Richard spoke again. "For confidentiality reasons, only a very small number of executives knew the identity of Argent Crest's principal owner." Nathan nodded. "I learned the truth during acquisition negotiations." He looked toward Sean again. "And I assure you, Mrs. Cox, it surprised me every bit as much as it's surprising you." Cora slowly sat back in her chair. The restaurant suddenly felt unfamiliar. The man across from her suddenly looked unfamiliar. Yet he hadn't changed at all. His blazer was still the same. His watch was still the inexpensive stainless steel model he had worn for years. His hands still carried the faint marks left by repairing things himself. Only one thing had changed: her understanding of him. Sean quietly picked up his fork again. "I believe," he said, "we've all had enough surprises for one evening." Nathan straightened. "Sir, tomorrow's board transition begins at 9. I'll be there?" Richard nodded respectfully. "We'll leave you to finish your dinner." Before turning away, Richard looked once more at Cora. "There will be a company-wide announcement Monday morning." He paused. "I suggest you arrive early." With that, both executives quietly walked toward their private dining room. The restaurant slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Servers continued carrying plates. Soft music filled the silence. Only Cora remained frozen. She looked across the table at the husband she had just handed divorce papers to. For the first time in 15 years, she realized she had absolutely no idea who Sean Cox really was. Cora's fingers slowly loosened around the stem of her water glass. She had spent years believing she could read people. It was one of the reasons Sterling promoted her so quickly. She could evaluate contractors, negotiate with developers, and identify promising managers after only a few meetings. Yet the man sitting less than 3 feet away had somehow remained a complete mystery for 15 years. She searched his face for any sign that this was some elaborate misunderstanding. There was none. Sean looked exactly the same as he had an hour earlier. Calm, patient, composed, almost impossibly composed. Finally, she spoke. "Why?" Sean looked up from his plate. "Why what? Why would you hide something like this?" "I didn't." Her eyebrows drew together. "You've never once told me you owned an investment company." "You never asked." She opened her mouth to object, then stopped. Because he was right. She had asked about his day. She had asked whether he could pick up groceries. She had asked if he remembered to schedule the furnace inspection. She had never asked whether he owned one of the country's fastest-growing private investment firms. The idea had simply never crossed her mind. Sean continued quietly. "I told you every month that I had business meetings. I thought they were maintenance conferences. I never said they were. You let me believe that. I answered every question you asked honestly." The realization stung more than she expected. He had never lied. She had simply filled in the blanks herself. Across the dining room, Nathan and Richard disappeared into the private room reserved for Sterling's executives. The door closed softly behind them. Only then did Cora speak again. "Does everyone know?" "No." "How many people?" Sean thought for a moment. "Very few." "Nathan?" "Yes." "Richard?" "Yes." "The attorneys?" "Some." "The bankers?" "Some." She shook her head slowly. "And me?" Sean's expression softened. "No." "No. You still don't." The words landed gently, yet they carried more weight than anger ever could. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means knowing what someone owns isn't the same as knowing who they are." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The waiter approached cautiously. "Would either of you care for dessert this evening?" Sean smiled politely. "Not yet." The waiter glanced between the two tense expressions. "I can come back later." "Thank you." As soon as he walked away, Cora leaned forward. "Did our marriage mean so little to you that you could keep something this important hidden?" Sean met her eyes. "It meant enough that I wanted to know whether you loved me without it." She froze. Those words echoed louder than anything Nathan or Richard had said. "What are you talking about?" Sean rested both hands on the table. "When we married, I had already begun rebuilding my family's investment business." She stared. "You had—" "Yes." "You never mentioned it." "It wasn't ready." "You were already wealthy, No." He shook his head. "Not then." "So when I started with almost nothing." His voice remained steady. "My grandfather built a successful real estate company decades ago." "I never knew that." "No." "My father expanded it." She continued listening. "Then a series of bad investments and the financial crisis destroyed nearly everything." "You lost it." "My family did." He paused. "I spent years rebuilding from what remained." She remembered something suddenly. "The weekends." Sean nodded. "The trips. The conferences. The days you disappeared every month. Meetings. With investors. Sometimes. Lawyers. Sometimes. Financial analysts." Sean nodded once. "Mostly." Every unexplained absence suddenly fit together. Every business trip she had ignored. Every phone call he had quietly taken outside. Every evening he returned home, looking tired but satisfied. She had assumed they involved boilers, elevators, and maintenance contracts. Instead, they had involved acquisitions, negotiations, capital, ownership. She whispered almost to herself. "I never even wondered." Sean heard her. No. You thought I wasn't ambitious. She looked down. I did. You thought I lacked confidence. Yes. You thought I had settled. Her silence answered for her. Sean wasn't accusing her. He was simply describing reality. The distinction somehow made it worse. She remembered dozens of conversations over the years. Times she had encouraged him to aim higher. Moments she had suggested executive coaching, networking events, career seminars. She had honestly believed she was helping him. Now each memory felt painfully different. I embarrassed you. Sean didn't answer immediately. He considered the question carefully. There were moments. Her face reddened. The charity gala. He nodded. The country club dinner. Another nod. When I introduced you as just a facilities manager. Sean remembered the evening clearly. A senior vice president had asked about his work. Before Sean could answer, Cora had smiled politely and said, "Oh, Sean keeps buildings running. My career is much less interesting." Several people had laughed. Sean had laughed too. Not because the joke was funny, because correcting it would have required explaining far more than he intended. Cora covered her mouth with one hand. I'm sorry. Sean looked at her quietly. I know you believed it. I did. You weren't trying to hurt me. No. You were trying to fit into a world you thought required appearances. A tear formed in the corner of her eye before she quickly wiped it away. I judged you. Sean offered a small, understanding smile. Most people did. But why let them? Because it taught me who valued titles. His answer lingered between them. The restaurant lights reflected softly against the windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Outside traffic moved normally through the evening. Inside, 15 years of assumptions continued falling apart. Cora looked directly at him. So, Sterling. Sean nodded. Yes. You bought the company. Argent Crest did. But you own Argent Crest. I do. She inhaled slowly. That means... He finished the sentence for her. Beginning tomorrow morning, Sterling Urban Development will become part of Argent Crest Capital. She stared. And technically... Sean didn't smile. I become the controlling owner of the company where you work. The sentence struck harder than she expected. Hours earlier, she had planned to leave her husband because she believed they no longer belonged in the same world. Now she realized they had never belonged to the worlds she imagined at all. For years, she had climbed a corporate ladder, believing she stood far above Sean. Tonight, she discovered the ladder had always been leaning against a building he quietly owned. Sean reached into his blazer and removed the envelope she had given him. He placed it gently on the table between them. I have read every page. She nodded silently. I understand your decision. Another pause. But before either of us signs anything, he rested one hand on the envelope. There are a few truths you deserve to hear. Cora looked at him without blinking. For the first time since their wedding day, she wasn't looking at Sean as the dependable husband who fixed broken fences and drove an old SUV. She was looking at a man whose life had been unfolding in parallel with hers for over a decade, a life she had never once thought to ask about. And she suddenly realized that the most important conversation of their marriage had only just begun. Monday morning arrived under a gray Columbus sky. Sterling Urban Development's headquarters looked no different from any other workday. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, laptops, and conversations about deadlines, construction schedules, and client meetings. Yet beneath the ordinary routine, something had changed. Rumors had spread throughout the weekend. No one knew exactly who had acquired Sterling, only that a private investment company named Argent Crest Capital had completed the purchase, and that an executive announcement would be held at 9 o'clock sharp in the main auditorium. Cora entered the building 20 minutes early. Richard Lawson's final words from Friday night echoed in her mind. "I suggest you arrive early." She understood why. Groups of employees stood in small circles throughout the lobby. Everyone seemed to have a different theory. "I heard it's a New York hedge fund." "My manager says the owners are from Chicago." Someone told me they're planning massive layoffs." "No, they're going public." Cora walked past them without joining the conversations. She barely slept over the weekend. Again and again she replayed Friday evening in her mind. Nathan calling Sean Sir. Richard addressing Sean with unmistakable respect. Sean quietly revealing that he owned Argent Crest. Nothing about the weekend had made the story easier to believe. When she entered the executive floor, Nathan Holloway was already standing outside the conference room. He noticed her immediately. "Good morning, Cora." She stopped in front of him. "Good morning." For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "I imagine you have questions." She gave a tired smile. "That's an understatement." Nathan nodded. "I understand." She searched his face. "You knew." "I did." "For how long?" "Since acquisition negotiations began." "Several months." "Yes." She looked toward the large windows overlooking downtown Columbus. "And you never said anything?" "I couldn't." "Because of confidentiality?" "Exactly." She accepted the answer. Professionally, she understood. Personally, it still hurt. Nathan lowered his voice. "Sean never asked anyone to deceive you." She looked back at him. "What do you mean?" "He specifically instructed everyone who knew his identity not to discuss his private life, so he protected his privacy." "Yes." "And mine." Nathan hesitated before continuing. "He also made one request." "What request?" "That no employment decisions involving you be influenced by your marriage." Cora frowned. "What does that mean?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "It means every promotion you've received was earned." She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that until that moment. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "I thought you deserved to know." Employees began filing toward the auditorium. Nathan glanced at his watch. "We should head downstairs." The auditorium filled quickly. Nearly 400 employees occupied the seats. Department managers clustered together near the front. Regional directors, including Cora, sat in the first several rows. The stage displayed Sterling's familiar logo on a large digital screen. People continued whispering. Every few seconds, someone checked their phone. At precisely 9 o'clock, the room lights dimmed. Richard Lawson walked onto the stage alone. The applause was polite but uncertain. He stood behind the podium and waited until the room became completely quiet. "Good morning, everyone." His voice carried confidently through the auditorium. "Thank you for joining us on short notice." He paused. "As many of you know, Sterling Urban Development has officially entered a new chapter." The company logo behind him slowly faded. A new logo appeared. Argent Crest Capital. Several employees exchanged nervous looks. Richard continued. "Over the past 8 months, our executive leadership has worked closely with Argent Crest to ensure a smooth transition." Cora listened carefully. Almost every sentence matched information she had already heard. Then Richard smiled. "There is one detail, however, that has remained confidential until this morning." The room became noticeably quieter. Richard stepped away from the podium. "I have had the privilege of serving Sterling for 19 years. He looked across the audience. "I've negotiated with exceptional investors." He paused. "I've worked alongside remarkable business leaders." Another pause. "But I have rarely encountered someone with greater patience, integrity, or long-term vision than the individual who now leads our company." Cora felt her heartbeat quicken. Richard turned toward the side entrance of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he smiled, "please welcome the founder and executive chairman of Argent Crest Capital." The doors opened. Sean walked onto the stage. No dramatic music played. No spotlight followed him. He wore the same navy suit he had worn at anniversary dinner. Simple black shoes, plain silver watch. Nothing about his appearance suggested extraordinary wealth. For nearly 3 full seconds, absolute silence filled the auditorium. Then confusion spread across hundreds of faces. Some employees recognized him immediately. Others looked around unsure whether they had seen the wrong person. A maintenance supervisor near the back whispered, "That's Sean." Another employee frowned. "The facilities guy." "No," someone else answered. "I've seen him here before." Cora remained perfectly still, watching hundreds of people experience exactly what she had experienced 3 days earlier felt strangely unreal. Sean reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone. "Good morning." His calm voice carried effortlessly through the room. "I realize many of you were expecting someone else." Soft laughter rippled through the audience. "I've discovered that expectations are often incomplete." A few more people smiled. Sean continued, "My name is Sean Cox." Another pause. "For those I've already met over the years, I've usually introduced myself simply as Sean." That was true. Many employees suddenly remembered brief conversations with him in hallways, elevators, parking lots, and cafeterias. He had always asked questions, never introduced titles, never mentioned ownership. Sean rested both hands on the podium. "Not how you right?" "I've spent the last several years visiting Sterling properties across Ohio." Employees looked at one another. "You've seen me walking construction sites." Heads nodded. "You've seen me speaking with maintenance teams." More nods. "You've probably wondered why I asked so many questions." A few quiet laughs followed. "I wasn't inspecting buildings." He smiled faintly. "I was learning about people." The room grew attentive. "I believe companies succeed for only one reason." He looked across every section of the auditorium. "People. Buildings can be purchased. Equipment can be replaced. Technology becomes obsolete. But honest, capable people remain every organization's greatest investment." No one interrupted. Sean's voice never became louder, yet every sentence held the room's attention. "I did not acquire Sterling to dismantle it." Visible relief spread through the audience. "I acquired Sterling because I believe this company deserves better leadership, stronger ethics, and a future built on trust rather than short-term numbers." Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. Sean continued, "Over the coming weeks, there will be changes." He spoke the words without hesitation. "There will also be opportunities." Then his expression became more serious. "And there will be accountability." The auditorium fell silent once again. In preparation for today's transition, Argent Crest conducted an independent operational review. Cora immediately recognized the significance of those words. An operational review, not just a financial audit. Sean continued calmly. "That review identified outstanding teams, dedicated employees." He paused. "And several areas requiring immediate investigation." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Sean glanced briefly toward the front row, where Grace Mitchell had quietly taken a seat. She stood carrying a thick binder marked "Confidential." Without a word, she walked toward the stage. Sean stepped aside to allow her to reach the podium. "Before this morning ends," he said, "you will hear the findings of our independent audit." The atmosphere inside the auditorium changed instantly. The acquisition announcement was over. Something far more serious was about to begin. Grace Mitchell placed the thick binder on the podium without theatrical flourish. The sound of its weight settling against the polished wood echoed through the silent auditorium. She adjusted the microphone. "My name is Grace Mitchell." Many employees recognized her immediately, others did not. She had spent the previous 6 months working quietly inside Sterling under the title of Senior Internal Auditor. Few people realized she had actually been appointed by Argent Crest Capital before the acquisition was finalized. Her assignment had never been to influence decisions. It had been to observe. She opened the binder. "First, I want to clarify something." Her voice remained steady. "This review was not conducted to justify layoffs." Several anxious faces relaxed. It was conducted to determine whether Sterling's operational practices matched the ethical standards required by its future ownership. Sean stood several feet behind her without interrupting. Grace continued. "Our team examined more than 32,000 financial transactions." A large screen behind her displayed a timeline of the investigation. "We reviewed vendor contracts covering the previous 5 fiscal years." The next slide appeared. "Construction bids." Another slide. "Procurement records." Another. "Expense reimbursements." Then one more. "Executive authorization procedures." The room remained completely silent. Grace looked across the audience. "I also want every employee to understand something very clearly." She paused. "The overwhelming majority of Sterling employees performed their jobs honestly." A visible sense of relief spread through the room. "Our investigation found exceptional project managers." She clicked to another slide. "Outstanding engineers." Another. "Dedicated maintenance personnel." Another. "Accounting teams whose records were consistently accurate." She smiled slightly. "In other words, most people here have absolutely nothing to fear." The atmosphere became noticeably less tense. Then Grace closed the slide presentation. "Unfortunately," the single word changed everything. "Our review also uncovered several serious irregularities." The screen behind her displayed a single heading. "Executive compliance findings." No names appeared yet, only categories: unauthorized vendor relationships, inflated consulting invoices, conflict of interest disclosures, contract steering, policy violations. A quiet murmur spread through the auditorium. Grace waited patiently until the room became quiet again. At this stage, no conclusions regarding criminal liability have been reached. She deliberately chose every word. "Our responsibility is to establish facts, not accusations." Facts. Sean watched from the side of the stage. This was exactly why he had selected Grace to lead the audit. She never exaggerated. She never speculated. She simply followed evidence. Grace turned another page. "Our review identified 7 executive-level compliance concerns." Several executives in the front rows shifted uneasily. She continued. "Those concerns involve 4 departments: operations, procurement, commercial development, executive administration." No individual names appeared on the screen. Cora sat perfectly still. Her department had just been mentioned. She felt dozens of employees glance towards the front rows before quickly looking away again. Grace continued speaking. "Let me repeat an important point." She looked directly into the audience. "Being associated with one of these departments does not imply wrongdoing." Several people nodded. "The purpose of this review is to separate documented facts from assumptions." Sean appreciated that sentence. For years, he had watched people build opinions based on assumptions. He had experienced it personally. Grace pressed the remote again. A new chart appeared. The timeline illustrated how the investigation had progressed month by month. Month 1, document collection. Month 2, vendor verification. Month 3, contract comparison. Month 4, financial tracing. Month 5, executive interviews. Month 6, independent verification. Nothing had been rushed. Everything had been documented. Grace closed the binder halfway. "I have one more announcement before discussing individual findings." She turned slightly toward Sean. "Mr. Cox requested that every executive, including those fully cleared by the audit, undergo identical review procedures. That statement immediately caught everyone's attention. Grace continued. He specifically instructed us that no employee, regardless of title, should receive preferential treatment. She looked toward the front row. That instruction included himself. A wave of surprise moved across the auditorium. Sean remained expressionless. Grace explained further. Mr. Cox voluntarily submitted his own financial disclosures related to Sterling. Another murmur followed. He also submitted every communication he had with Sterling executives during acquisition negotiations. Several department heads exchanged surprised looks. One manager quietly whispered, "He investigated himself." The colleague beside him nodded slowly. "I guess he did," Grace continued. "Our audit found no evidence that Mr. Cox improperly influenced employment decisions before acquiring Sterling." She turned another page. "We specifically reviewed promotion records involving employees who had personal contact with him." Cora lowered her eyes. Grace never mentioned her name. She didn't have to. "Our conclusion was unanimous." She read directly from the report. "No employment action was improperly influenced by the future ownership transition." Sean remained exactly where he was. He neither smiled nor reacted. The report spoke for itself. Grace closed that section of the binder. "Now we will address the first compliance finding." The screen changed again. Finding number 1. Undisclosed vendor relationships. A diagram appeared connecting several construction vendors through shared ownership records. No names were visible yet. Grace explained carefully. "During routine contract verification, we discovered that 3 vendors repeatedly received projects despite consistently submitting higher bids." The audience listened intently. "Our review found that these companies were connected through common ownership interests." Another slide appeared. Each company had a different name, different address, different branding. Yet all 3 ultimately traced back to the same holding company. Several procurement employees frowned. One quietly shook his head. Grace continued. "This ownership relationship had not been disclosed during Sterling's bidding process." She paused. "As a result, what appeared to be competitive bidding was in reality controlled by a single financial interest." The room remained silent. Sean noticed several employees taking notes. Exactly as he had hoped. People were paying attention to the process rather than searching for gossip. Grace looked toward the audience again. "I want everyone to understand that discovering a compliance issue does not automatically identify who created it." She deliberately emphasized the distinction. "The investigation continues." Another slide appeared. Finding number 2. Executive expense irregularities. Again, no names, only verified numbers. Duplicate reimbursements, personal travel billed as business travel. Luxury entertainment categorized as client development. Grace summarized the findings without dramatic language. Most expense reports throughout Sterling were accurate. She looked across the accounting department. "Your work was excellent." Several accountants visibly relaxed. The irregularities were concentrated within a very small number of executive accounts. Again, no names. Sean approved. Public humiliation before verified conclusions had never been his style. Grace closed the binder completely. "Detailed interviews with the individuals involved will begin this afternoon." She looked directly at the audience. "Those interviews will be conducted respectfully. They will also be documented, and they will follow established legal procedures. No one could accuse Argent Crest of conducting a witch hunt. Everything would be transparent. Everything would be supported by evidence." Grace stepped away from the podium. Sean returned to the microphone. "I know today's presentation raises many questions." He looked around the auditorium. "You deserve answers. You will receive them. But not before the facts are complete." He paused. "I did not purchase Sterling to punish honest employees." He let the sentence settle. "I purchased Sterling because honest employees deserve leadership they can trust." The auditorium remained silent for a heartbeat. Then, somewhere near the middle rows, a single employee began clapping, another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The applause was not for an acquisition. It was not for a billionaire. It was for the possibility that for the first time in years, integrity might become the company's most valuable asset. From the front row, Cora watched her husband accept the standing ovation without raising his hands or taking a bow. He simply waited for the applause to end. Then he spoke one final sentence. "This is only the beginning." Cora stood silently in the doorway of Sean's office. The room was nothing like the executive offices she had visited throughout her career. There was no oversized mahogany desk positioned like a throne, no expensive sculptures displayed for prestige, no wall covered with awards. Instead, the office reflected the same man she had lived with for 15 years. Everything had a purpose. Nothing existed simply to impress. Sean walked to a cabinet near the window and removed 2 coffee mugs. One was plain white. The other carried the faded logo of Ohio State University. "You still have that?" Cora asked. Sean smiled. "It still works." She recognized it immediately. She had given him that mug during their second Christmas together. The printed logo had nearly worn away, yet he had kept it. He filled both mugs from a small coffee machine in the corner. "No assistant?" she asked. "I make my own coffee." "You always have." "I enjoy it." He handed her the white mug before sitting at the small conference table instead of behind his desk. Another detail she hadn't expected. He wasn't placing a piece of furniture between them. She slowly sat opposite him. For several moments, neither spoke. The city stretched beyond the glass walls behind Sean. Construction cranes moved in the distance. Traffic flowed steadily through downtown Columbus. Finally, Cora broke the silence. "How many people work here?" "A little over 400. "And all of this?" She looked around the executive floor. "You built—" Sean considered the question. "No." She looked surprised. "I rebuilt it." He took a sip of coffee. "When my grandfather started the company, it occupied 2 rented rooms above a hardware store." "I never knew." "My father expanded it." He looked toward one of the framed photographs on the bookshelf. It showed an older man wearing work boots, smiling beside a partially completed apartment building. He believed real estate wasn't about buildings. What was it about? Communities. Sean stood and picked up the photograph. "My grandfather used to say that every building eventually belongs to someone else's grandchildren." He handed the frame to Cora. "So build something worth inheriting." She studied the picture. There was no luxury, only pride. "You kept this on your desk?" "Every day." She carefully returned the frame. "I understand where Argent Crest came from now." Sean shook his head gently. "Only part of it." He walked toward the large window. "When everything collapsed, my family lost nearly everything." "You told me." "What I didn't tell you is how close we came to losing the company completely." He looked down at the streets below. "There were weeks when payroll almost didn't happen." "Really?" "Several." "You never mentioned any of this." "I wasn't looking for sympathy." He turned back toward her. "I was looking for solutions." A quiet knock interrupted the conversation. The office door remained open. Grace Mitchell stood outside carrying another binder. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sean smiled. "Come in." Grace entered. "Your 1 o'clock interviews are confirmed." "Excellent." She noticed Cora and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon." "You led the audit." "I did." Cora hesitated. "I wanted to thank you." Grace looked surprised. "For what?" "For being fair." Grace nodded. Fairness was never optional. Sean accepted the interview schedule from her. "Any changes?" "One." Grace opened the binder. "We've expanded the ethics review." Sean looked interested. Explain. We interviewed more than 80 employees after Friday. So many? Word spreads quickly. Sean smiled faintly. It usually does, Grace continued. Several employees voluntarily provided additional information after hearing your presentation. Sean became more serious. They trust the process. They appear to. He looked at the schedule again. Good. Grace closed the binder. I'll leave you two to finish. After she departed, Cora watched the door close. She respects you. Sean answered immediately. I hope she respects the work. You always separate yourself from your title. I try. She leaned back in her chair. I don't understand something. What? If you own all of this. She gestured toward the windows overlooking the headquarters. Why keep living the way we did? Sean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one of the desk drawers. Inside sat a worn leather notebook. He placed it on the table. I've carried this for years. She opened it carefully. Every page contained handwritten notes, not financial projections, not investment strategies. Simple sentences. Treat people better than contracts require. Never confuse wealth with worth. Listen longer than you speak. Character compounds faster than money. She looked up. You wrote these? Some. The others. My grandfather. She continued turning pages. One sentence had been underlined several times. If money changes who you are only renting your character. She quietly read it again. Then again. Sean spoke softly. When I was rebuilding Argent Crest, I made myself one promise. What promise? That if the company ever succeeded... He looked around the office. My life wouldn't become a performance. She understood what he meant. No private jets. I charter when necessary. No mansion. Our house was enough. No expensive watches. He glanced at the simple silver watch on his wrist. It tells time. She laughed quietly, despite herself. You really mean that? I do. Another silence settled between them. This one felt different, not uncomfortable, reflective. Cora slowly closed the notebook. I spent years believing success looked a certain way. Sean nodded. So did many investors. And they were wrong. Some still are. She looked around the office again. Every employee she had seen in the building seemed relaxed, focused, comfortable approaching Sean. She hadn't witnessed fear. She had witnessed trust. Is that why your office has glass walls? Sean smiled. Partly. So people can see you. So I remember they can. She stared at him. What does that mean? If I close myself behind doors, eventually people stop telling me the truth. He walked toward the glass wall overlooking the collaborative workspace. Transparency shouldn't be something leaders demand. He rested one hand lightly against the glass. It should be something they model. At that moment, Emma Collins appeared outside the office. She knocked once. Sean motioned her inside. The interview team is ready, she said. Sean checked the time. It was nearly 1 o'clock. The first executive has arrived. Emma nodded. Yes. Who? She glanced briefly at the schedule. The procurement vice president. Sean closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. He looked toward Cora. This next part isn't easy. She stood. I should leave. You don't have to. She searched his expression. Are you asking me to stay? Sean thought for a moment before answering. I'm asking you to see how decisions are made. Emma quietly waited by the door. The hallway outside had grown noticeably busier. Legal counsel had arrived. Compliance officers carried case files into the conference room. Interview teams were taking their places. The real work of rebuilding Sterling was no longer about announcements or applause. It was about accountability. Sean picked up the first investigation file and walked toward the conference room. Before opening the door, he paused. He looked back at Cora. "For years," he said calmly, "you thought leadership meant being the most important person in the room." He rested his hand on the conference room handle. "I've learned it usually means making the hardest decision in it." He opened the door. The first executive interview was about to begin. The conference room door closed quietly behind Sean. Unlike the executive offices at Sterling, this room had no elevated seat at the head of the table. Everyone sat at the same level. Sean had insisted on that design years earlier. Across the table sat Victor Langford Sterling's Vice President of Procurement. Beside him was his attorney. Emma Collins sat to Sean's left. Grace Mitchell occupied the seat across from Emma with several organized binders. A court reporter prepared the official transcript. Sean took his seat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Langford." Victor nodded. "Good afternoon." Sean folded his hands on the table. "Before we begin, I want to explain the purpose of today's meeting." Victor remained silent. "This is an administrative interview." Sean looked directly at him. "No conclusions have been reached. No disciplinary decisions have been made. And you will have every opportunity to respond to the information presented." Victor glanced toward his attorney before answering. "I understand." Grace opened the first binder. "Our review concerns procurement practices between January of last year and the present." She placed several documents in front of Victor. "Please take a moment to review these." Victor slowly examined the papers. His expression remained controlled. Sean watched quietly. Years earlier, he had learned an important lesson during negotiations. Silence often revealed more than questioning. After nearly 2 minutes, Victor looked up. "These are purchase approvals." "Correct," Grace replied. "They contain my signature." "They do." Sean finally spoke. "Can you explain why 3 different vendors repeatedly submitted nearly identical proposals?" Victor frowned. "I don't know." Grace slid another document across the table. "These corporate ownership records were obtained from the Secretary of State." Victor studied them. "The companies appear unrelated." "They appear that way." Grace turned another page. "The beneficial ownership filings tell a different story." She pointed toward several highlighted sections. "The 3 vendors ultimately report to the same holding company." Victor looked more closely. His forehead tightened. "I wasn't aware of that." Sean asked calmly, "Did anyone disclose that relationship during the bidding process?" "No." Emma made a brief note. Sean nodded once. "Thank you." The interview continued for another 40 minutes. No accusations, only documents, questions, verified answers. When it ended, Sean stood. "Thank you for your cooperation." Victor looked genuinely exhausted. "Am I being terminated?" Sean answered honestly. "No decision has been made?" Victor looked surprised. Sean continued. "Our responsibility is to determine facts before consequences." Victor slowly nodded. "I appreciate that." After he left, Emma closed her notebook. He appeared truthful. Grace agreed. "I think so too." Sean looked toward the binders. The ownership structure was deliberately concealed. Emma nodded. "The evidence points higher?" Sean quietly replied, "Then that's where we'll continue." Throughout the afternoon, additional interviews followed. Department directors, finance managers, project administrators. Most ended the same way. Employees answered questions, documents were verified, misunderstandings were clarified. Again and again, the investigation confirmed what Sean had believed from the beginning. Most people had done nothing wrong. By 5 o'clock, nearly a dozen employees had been completely cleared. Word spread quickly through Sterling. People who had feared the audit began speaking openly. Several voluntarily submitted additional records. Others requested interviews of their own. Instead of hiding information, employees started bringing it forward. Emma noticed the change immediately. She entered Sean's office carrying another folder. "You were right." Sean looked up from his desk. About what? Transparency. He waited. The more fairly people are treated. She smiled slightly. The more willingly they cooperate. Sean closed the file he had been reading. Trust grows slowly. And disappears quickly. He nodded. Exactly. A soft knock interrupted them. Nathan Holloway entered. You wanted to see me. Sean motioned toward a chair. Nathan sat. Emma remained. Sean opened a separate folder. This concerns executive travel. Nathan nodded. I assumed it would. Grace entered a moment later with another stack of documents. The reimbursement comparison is complete. She distributed copies. Nathan studied the first page. Several expense reports had been highlighted. Most belonged to senior executives. A handful had already been explained through supporting documentation. Others remained unresolved. Sean looked around the table. I want to be very clear. Everyone listened. No one is to assume a misconduct simply because an expense appears unusual. Grace nodded. Every item must be verified independently. Nathan leaned forward. One pattern concerns me. Sean gestured for him to continue. The same luxury resort appears repeatedly. Emma checked the spreadsheet. So does the same consulting firm. Grace opened another binder. We traced both. Sean looked at her. And the consulting firm billed Sterling approximately $2.8 million over 4 years. Nathan frowned. I don't remember approving that much. You didn't. Grace pointed towards several authorization signatures. The approvals originated elsewhere. Emma studied the signatures carefully. They're legitimate. Sean asked the obvious question. But were the services... Grace opened another section. That's the issue. She placed several invoices on the table. The descriptions are unusually vague. Strategic advisory services, executive consulting, development coordination. Sean read each invoice carefully. Any deliverables? Grace shook her head. None. Nathan looked increasingly uncomfortable. I've never even met these consultants. Emma looked up. Neither have I. Sean remained thoughtful. Continue tracing the payments. Grace nodded. We already have. She turned to the final page. The consulting company transferred substantial portions of those payments within 48 hours. To whom? Grace met Sean's eyes. We're still confirming. The room became quiet. Sean knew the investigation had reached a turning point. The earlier findings involved procedural failures. This suggested something potentially much larger. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Columbus. The evening sun reflected against neighboring buildings. Years earlier, he had promised himself that if Argent Crest ever became successful, integrity would never become negotiable. That promise was now being tested. He turned back toward the group. No shortcuts. Emma nodded. No assumptions. Grace added. No leaks. Nathan agreed. No exceptions. Sean smiled faintly. Good. His phone buzzed softly on the desk. The caller identification displayed Richard Lawson. Sean answered. Richard! I thought you should know. Sean listened. What happened? Richard's voice remained measured. News of the audit has reached the board. I expected that. They're requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Sean considered that for a moment. Approved. Richard hesitated. There's something else. Sean waited. 2 board members have retained outside counsel. Emma immediately looked up. Grace stopped writing. Nathan exchanged a glance with Sean. They're preparing for something, Richard said quietly. Sean's expression did not change. They're preparing for accountability. He ended the call. Emma broke the silence. This is moving faster than expected. Sean nodded once. It usually does when evidence starts connecting. Grace closed the final binder. We should be ready by tomorrow. Sean looked around the room. No. The others looked puzzled. We'll be ready when the facts are complete. He paused. Not 1 minute earlier. Outside the conference room, the lights across Argent Crest headquarters gradually dimmed as employees finished their workday. Inside, however, the investigation was only beginning to uncover the truth. The next morning's emergency board meeting promised to reveal just how deeply the hidden network inside Sterling actually reached. By 8:30 the next morning, the executive boardroom at Sterling Urban Development was nearly full. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous board meetings. Conversations were shorter, smiles were rarer. Every board member had received Grace Mitchell's preliminary compliance summary the night before. It contained no accusations, only documented findings. Even so, everyone understood the implications. Richard Lawson stood near the front of the room, quietly speaking with the corporate secretary. Nathan Holloway reviewed a folder of operational reports. Emma Collins arranged several legal binders at one end of the conference table. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sean entered. The room immediately fell silent. He acknowledged everyone with a simple nod before taking his seat. No dramatic entrance, no lengthy introduction, just quiet confidence. Richard opened the meeting. Good morning. He looked around the table. This is the first official board meeting following Sterling's acquisition by Argent Crest Capital. He paused. I'll begin by welcoming our new executive chairman, Sean Cox. Several members offered polite applause. Sean thanked them with a brief nod. Richard continued. Our agenda today consists of 2 items. He looked toward Sean. Corporate governance and the compliance review. Sean stood. Thank you, Richard. He walked toward the presentation screen. The first slide appeared. Building trust, not maximizing control. Several board members exchanged curious glances. Sean began. When companies change ownership, leaders often begin by discussing authority. He looked around the room. I'd rather begin by discussing responsibility. The next slide appeared. Integrity, transparency, accountability. 3 simple words. Sean continued. I didn't acquire Sterling simply because I believed it could become more profitable. He paused. I acquired it because I believed it could become better. The room remained completely attentive. Sean pressed the remote. A new organizational chart appeared. Beginning today, Argent Crest will implement several governance reforms. He explained each one carefully. Independent ethics reporting. Mandatory executive disclosure updates. Competitive vendor verification. Anonymous employee reporting channels. Annual external compliance audits. No proposal sounded revolutionary. Each reflected practices Sean had already implemented years earlier inside Argent Crest. One board member raised his hand. His name was Daniel Pierce. He had served on Sterling's board for nearly 12 years. Mr. Cox. Sean nodded. Go ahead. These reforms will increase operating costs. They will. Daniel leaned back slightly. How do you justify that expense? Sean answered immediately. Because integrity is less expensive than corruption. Several members quietly nodded. Sean continued. The financial cost of preventing misconduct is almost always lower than the financial cost of repairing it. No one challenged the logic. Another board member spoke. Margaret Ellis, a retired banking executive. I support these recommendations. Others nodded in agreement. Sean moved to the final slide. Questions. None came. Richard smiled. I believe we have consensus. The governance reforms were approved unanimously. Emma made the official record. Sean sat again. Richard looked toward Grace Mitchell. The compliance review? Grace stood. Unlike yesterday's employee presentation, today's discussion contained far more detail. She distributed confidential binders. These materials remain privileged. Every board member acknowledged the instruction. Grace opened the first section. Our investigation has now reviewed approximately 96% of executive financial records. The screen displayed updated statistics. Most departments had been fully cleared: employee reimbursements, project accounting, regional operations, construction management. Each category showed green. Then one section remained yellow. Executive procurement oversight, Grace continued. We have narrowed the remaining concerns to a limited number of executive authorizations. She displayed several transaction timelines. Payments moved from sterling to consulting firms, then through multiple holding companies, finally into private investment entities. No conclusions yet, only documented financial movement. Daniel Pierce leaned forward. Have these transfers been explained? Not sufficiently, Grace answered calmly. Emma added, additional interviews are scheduled. Sean listened without interrupting. Grace changed slides again. The consulting invoices total approximately $2.8 million. Several members frowned. The supporting documentation remains incomplete. Richard quietly asked, any indication the services were actually performed? Grace shook her head. We have found no evidence confirming that. Silence settled over the room. Then Emma spoke. Yesterday afternoon, we received additional documents from 3 employees. Grace nodded. Those documents independently support several timeline inconsistencies. Sean finally asked. What changed? Grace answered. Employees now believe they'll be heard fairly. Sean wasn't surprised. Fear discouraged honesty. Trust encouraged it. The meeting continued for another hour. Every question returned to one principle: evidence first, conclusions later. Eventually, Grace reached the final section. She closed one binder before opening another, marked restricted. This information has not yet been shared outside this room. Every board member became noticeably more attentive. Grace removed a single document. Our forensic accounting team completed overnight verification. She placed copies before Sean, Richard, Emma, and the board. Sean carefully read the first page. His expression remained calm. Inside, however, his thoughts sharpened immediately. The financial trail was becoming unmistakably clear. He had expected negligence. What he was seeing suggested coordination. He looked toward Grace. Confidence level: 98%. Verification: 3 independent sources. Emma studied the report. This changes things. Richard agreed. It certainly does. Daniel looked between them. What exactly are we looking at? Grace answered carefully. We have confirmed that multiple consulting payments ultimately benefited an undisclosed financial partnership. She paused. That partnership included one current Sterling executive. A wave of silence swept across the boardroom. No name appeared on the screen. Not yet. Sean folded his hands. Before anyone speculates, he looked around the room. The individual involved will receive exactly the same procedural fairness as every employee. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Emma nodded. The interview is already scheduled. Richard checked the agenda. This afternoon. Sean looked once more at the report. His instincts told him the investigation had reached its most critical stage. If today's interview confirmed the remaining evidence, the audit would no longer concern policy violations alone. It would become a matter of deliberate deception. Just then, someone knocked on the boardroom door. The corporate secretary entered quietly. I'm sorry to interrupt. Richard looked up. Yes. She handed him a sealed envelope. It was delivered by courier 5 minutes ago. Richard examined the envelope. No return address. Only one line typed neatly across the front. For the attention of Sean Cox. Richard passed it across the table. Sean opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature, no greeting. Just one sentence. If you want the whole truth, stop looking at the contracts and start looking at the land. Sean read the sentence twice. He felt no fear, only curiosity. Someone somewhere knew much more than the audit had uncovered, and they had just pointed the investigation in an entirely new direction. Sean read the anonymous note one final time before placing it back inside the envelope. The boardroom remained silent. Richard looked at him. "What do you think?" Sean answered honestly. "I think someone wants us to find something." Emma studied the paper. "Or someone wants to distract us." "That's possible." Grace spoke next. "Either way, we verify before we believe." Sean nodded. "Exactly." He looked around the room. "No one changes the investigation based on an anonymous message." Several board members relaxed. Sean continued. "But we also don't ignore information simply because we don't know the source." Emma picked up the note again. "The wording is interesting." "How so?" Richard asked. "It doesn't say we're looking in the wrong place." She tapped the sentence. "It says we're not looking far enough." Sean considered that observation. She was right. The contracts explained where the money had gone. The land might explain why. He turned toward Grace. "How many major property acquisitions has Sterling completed over the last 5 years?" Grace checked her notes. 43. Prioritize the ones connected to the consulting firms." She nodded. "I'll have a preliminary report this afternoon." Sean stood. "Meeting adjourned." Board members slowly filed out of the room. Some continued discussing the audit in quiet voices. Others remained unusually thoughtful. No one ignored the anonymous letter. No one treated it as proof either. That balance was exactly what Sean wanted. 20 minutes later, Sean, Emma, Grace, and Nathan gathered in a smaller conference room at Argent Crest headquarters. The atmosphere was focused. Grace projected a map onto the screen. Red markers identified every major property Sterling had purchased during the previous 5 years. Blue markers represented projects completed without irregularities. Yellow markers indicated acquisitions associated with the consulting firm under investigation. Only 6 remained yellow. Grace enlarged the map. "These 6 properties all share one unusual characteristic." Nathan leaned forward. "They were purchased before nearby infrastructure improvements were announced." Sean immediately understood, meaning the land values increased dramatically afterward. Emma looked at the data. "By coincidence?" Grace shook her head. "The timing is statistically unlikely." She changed slides. Each property had been purchased months before major highway expansions, commercial zoning approvals, or municipal redevelopment announcements. Nathan frowned. "Those decisions weren't public." "No." Grace pointed toward the timeline. "But someone clearly anticipated them." Sean folded his arms. "Insider information." "Possibly." Emma added, "Or extraordinary luck." Sean smiled faintly. "I don't build investigations on luck." Grace opened another file. "There is something else." She displayed ownership records. Before Sterling purchased each property, a small investment company quietly acquired neighboring parcels. The company names differed. Their mailing addresses differed. But once again, the beneficial ownership traced back to the same network of holding companies. Nathan looked at Sean. "This is getting bigger." Sean nodded slowly. "It is." Emma asked, "Who benefited from the appreciation?" Grace highlighted the ownership flow. "The neighboring parcels were sold after the public infrastructure announcements." "For a profit," Grace answered with a single number. $47.6 million. Silence filled the room. Nathan looked back at the map. "Sterling wasn't just buying land." Sean finished the thought. Someone was positioning private investments beside Sterling's projects. Emma quietly added, "and profiting from information the public didn't have." Sean stared at the screen. Inside, his thoughts became increasingly focused. If the evidence held, this wasn't simply inflated consulting invoices, it was a coordinated strategy. Sterling's legitimate development plans had been used to create private investment opportunities. He looked toward Grace. How confident are we? 85%. Why not higher? We still need to connect the ownership network directly to an individual. Sean nodded. Then we aren't finished. A knock interrupted the meeting. Daniel, the security director, stepped inside. Sorry to interrupt. Sean looked up. What is it? A visitor. Sean raised an eyebrow. Expected? No. Daniel handed him a business card. There was only a name. Michael Donovan. No company, no title. Sean looked at Emma. Do we know him? She shook her head. Grace did the same. Nathan frowned. Should I have security escort him out? Sean thought for a moment. What did he say? Daniel answered. He said he has information about Sterling's land acquisitions. The room became quiet. Sean glanced at the anonymous note still lying on the conference table. The timing was impossible to ignore. Yet timing alone proved nothing. He looked at Daniel. Bring him to interview room 3. Daniel nodded. 5 minutes later, a man in his early 60s entered the room. He wore a worn brown jacket and carried a weathered leather briefcase. He looked more like a retired surveyor than a corporate whistleblower. Sean stood and extended his hand. I'm Sean Cox. The man shook it firmly. I know. Sean motioned toward a chair. Please sit. The man did. My name is Michael Donovan. Sean waited. I worked as an independent land survey consultant for nearly 30 years. Emma quietly activated the audio recorder. Michael noticed. Good. He reached into his briefcase. I'd rather everything be recorded. Sean appreciated that answer. Michael removed several folded maps, then old field notebooks. Finally, a thick envelope. I retired 18 months ago. He placed the documents on the table. I thought I was finished with all this. Sean asked, what changed? Michael looked directly at him. I watched your employee meeting yesterday. Sean remained silent. Michael continued. When you said honest people deserved leadership, they could trust. He paused. When? I decided it was finally time. He slid the envelope across the table. Sean opened it carefully. Inside were copies of handwritten survey notes dated years earlier. Each referenced land parcels already highlighted in Grace's investigation. Michael spoke quietly. I was asked to redraw several boundary surveys. Emma immediately looked up. Redraw? They weren't technically false. He chose his words carefully. They were selective. Sean asked, selective how? Michael pointed to one map. Certain easements. Another. Future access roads. Another. Utility corridors. He looked around the room. Nothing illegal by itself. He paused. But if someone knew where future development would occur, he tapped the map. They could quietly buy the neighboring land before everyone else understood its value. Grace compared the maps with her investigation timeline. The alignment was remarkable. Nathan leaned back slowly. So that's why the anonymous note mentioned the land. Michael nodded once. The contracts were only the surface. Sean looked down at the maps spread across the conference table. For the first time since the investigation had begun, the separate pieces were beginning to fit together. The consulting invoices, the hidden ownership companies, the strategic land purchases, the infrastructure announcements. They were no longer isolated events. They formed a pattern. Sean carefully closed the envelope. Then he looked at Michael. You've helped us understand the picture. Michael gave a tired smile. No. He looked toward the maps one last time. I've only shown you where to start digging. The investigation had just entered an entirely new phase. The maps remained spread across the conference table long after Michael Donovan finished speaking. No one reached for them immediately. Each person in the room understood that the investigation had crossed an important threshold. Until now, they had been following financial records. Now they were beginning to understand the strategy behind those records. Sean finally broke the silence. Mr. Donovan. Michael looked up. Yes. Why didn't you come forward sooner? The older man rested both hands on the table. Because I wasn't sure anyone would listen. Sean nodded. That's fair. Michael continued. I never signed false surveys. He pointed toward one of the maps. I simply noticed that certain parcels were being requested far more often than they should have been. He turned another page. Different companies. Different attorneys. Different developers. But eventually I realized the same small group of people kept appearing. Emma asked, Did you report your concerns to anyone? I mentioned them once. What happened? Michael gave a tired smile. I was told I was imagining patterns. Grace quietly wrote down the response. Sean understood something important. Many unethical systems survived not because everyone participated. They survived because honest people gradually convinced themselves that speaking up would accomplish nothing. Sean looked at Michael. You did the right thing by coming here. I hope so. You did? Michael slid one final envelope across the table. I also brought copies. Sean opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten journals documenting survey requests over nearly 7 years. Every entry included dates, property numbers, client representatives, field observations. Grace's eyes widened. This is incredibly detailed. Michael shrugged modestly. I kept notes because that's how I organized my work. Sean smiled slightly. Sometimes good habits become important evidence. Grace immediately began comparing the journal entries with Sterling's acquisition timeline. Within minutes, she noticed another connection. Sean. He looked over. The dates. What about them? She pointed to 2 separate pages. The survey requests consistently happened several weeks before Sterling authorized formal due diligence. Nathan frowned. Meaning someone already knew which properties Sterling intended to pursue? Emma finished the thought. Long before those plans became public. Sean slowly nodded. That wasn't coincidence. Someone with access to confidential planning information had almost certainly shared it. The question was still who, and why. Grace continued working quietly. The more pages she compared, the more complete the pattern became. She looked up. I think we've identified another common factor. Sean waited. Every one of these projects ultimately required approval from the Strategic Development Committee. Nathan immediately recognized the significance. That's a very small group. Exactly. Emma looked at Sean. We're narrowing the field. Sean answered calmly. We're narrowing the facts. An hour later, Michael thanked everyone and prepared to leave. Sean walked him to the elevator personally. Before the doors opened, Michael turned back. I've spent the last year wondering whether I should have spoken sooner. Sean answered without hesitation. The important thing is that you spoke. Michael smiled. I appreciate that. As the elevator doors closed, Sean stood quietly for a moment. He thought about how many honest people remained silent simply because they believed their voices wouldn't matter. That had to change. Not only at Sterling, everywhere Argent Crest invested. He returned to the conference room. Grace had already organized the new documents into digital evidence folders. Emma was reviewing legal procedures. Nathan stood near the window. Sean took his seat. I've been thinking. Everyone looked toward him. We've spent the last week responding to problems. He paused. I want us to begin building solutions. Nathan nodded. What do you have in mind? Sean looked toward Emma first. I want a permanent ethics office established inside Sterling. Emma smiled. I've already drafted the proposal. Sean laughed quietly. I suspected you might have. Grace added, it should report directly to the board, not management. Sean nodded. Agreed. Emma made a note. Sean continued. I also want mandatory ethics training. Nathan asked for everyone. Grace smiled. That's unusual. Sean leaned back. Integrity isn't an executive skill. It's an organizational habit. The room fell quiet. Emma finally said, I'll begin implementation immediately. Sean turned toward Nathan. I'd also like to create something else. Nathan waited. An employee recognition program. Nathan looked surprised. For what? Sean answered simply. Doing the right thing. Grace looked up from her laptop. You mean not just rewarding performance? Sean nodded. We celebrate results. He paused. We should also celebrate character. Nathan smiled. I like that. Sean continued. I've seen too many companies reward only numbers. The message becomes clear. Produce results. No matter how. Emma added softly. And eventually someone believes the rules are optional. Sean nodded. Exactly. Later that afternoon, Sean asked Richard Lawson to join them. Richard entered carrying several folders. I hear you've been busy. Sean smiled. We all have. Richard sat down. What do you need? Sean slid a document across the table. I'd like your opinion. Richard began reading. The title caught his attention immediately. Sterling Future Leaders Scholarship Program. He looked up. A scholarship. Sean nodded. I've been thinking about the communities Sterling serves. Richard continued reading. The proposal established annual college scholarships for students pursuing engineering construction management, architecture, environmental science, and skilled trades. Priority would be given to students from neighborhoods where Sterling had completed development projects. Richard smiled broadly. This isn't a public relations initiative. No, it's an investment. Sean nodded. My grandfather believed every successful project should improve more than a balance sheet. Nathan quietly added. This does exactly that. Sean continued. I also want paid summer internships. For scholarship recipients. Grace smiled. They'll gain experience. And opportunities. Sean nodded. Exactly. Richard closed the proposal. I've spent decades in this industry. He looked directly at Sean. I've seen companies build offices. I've seen companies build profits. He paused. Very few build futures. Sean appreciated the compliment, but simply replied, We'll start next semester. Richard laughed. I had a feeling you'd say that. By late afternoon, the board unanimously approved the scholarship program. An internal announcement was prepared for employees. A public announcement would follow after the legal review concluded. As the meeting ended, Cora quietly entered the executive floor. She had spent the entire day meeting with her own regional team. When she saw Sean reviewing the scholarship documents, she stopped. You're still working? Sean looked up. A little. She noticed the proposal in front of him. What's this? He handed it to her. She read silently. The more she read, the quieter she became. Finally, she looked up. You're using the acquisition to create scholarships. Sean nodded. Success should create opportunity. She studied him for a long moment. During the past week, she had watched him reveal one unexpected side of himself after another. Not through dramatic speeches, not through displays of wealth, through choices. She realized something she had never fully understood during their marriage. Sean had never been trying to become the richest man in the room. He had been trying to become the kind of leader whose success would still matter long after he was gone. For the first time in many years, Cora wondered whether she had spent too much time measuring achievement and not enough time understanding the person standing beside her. The scholarship proposal remained on Sean's desk long after the meeting ended. Cora continued reading each page carefully. There were no photographs prepared for a press release, no marketing slogans, no references to Sean himself. The program focused entirely on students, engineering scholarships, trade apprenticeships, mentorship opportunities, paid internships, community partnerships. She finally looked up. "You're not putting your name on it?" Sean shook his head. "No? Why not, Therese? The scholarships aren't about me." "They could be. I don't want them to be." He closed the folder. "I've accepted enough recognition for work I didn't accomplish alone." Cora quietly studied him. "I don't think I ever understood you." Sean answered gently. "I don't think I always made myself easy to understand." The honesty surprised her. For the first time in days, neither of them was defending the past. They were simply acknowledging it. Sean glanced at the clock. "It's almost 6. "I know. Would you like to have dinner?" She looked at him with visible surprise. "Dinner? There's a cafe downstairs." "Not another anniversary dinner?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Just dinner." She hesitated for only a moment. "I'd like that." They rode the elevator to the first floor. Unlike the executive floor, the cafe was open to every employee. Analysts sat beside accountants. Receptionists shared tables with project managers. Several interns laughed together near the windows. When Sean entered, employees greeted him naturally. "Evening, Sean. Have a good night. Congratulations on the scholarship program." Sean smiled. "Thank you." Cora noticed something again. No one rushed to flatter him. No one appeared nervous. The conversation simply continued after each greeting. They collected their meals from the counter. Sean chose grilled chicken vegetables and iced tea. Cora laughed quietly. "You still order the same thing." "I like routine." "You really do." They found a table near the window overlooking the city. For several minutes, they simply ate. It felt strangely familiar, like dozens of ordinary dinners they had shared over the years, except neither of them was pretending anymore. Cora finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Sean looked at her. "You don't have to." "I do." She placed her fork down. "I judged you." He remained silent. "I measured your success by your job title." She looked down briefly. "I kept comparing you to other executives." Her voice softened. "I never asked whether you were happy." Sean listened without interruption. She continued. "I convinced myself ambition always looked the same." She smiled sadly. "Corner office. Luxury car. Public recognition." She looked around the cafe. "I never imagined someone could build all this while still choosing to live quietly." Sean answered after a thoughtful pause. "I wasn't trying to hide success." He looked out the window. "I was trying to protect normal life." She nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Sean took a sip of iced tea. "I wasn't perfect either." She looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I avoided difficult conversations." He met her eyes. "When you started measuring our lives differently," he paused, "I noticed." "You did?" "Months before the anniversary." "Why didn't you say something?" He answered honestly. "I hoped we'd find our way back naturally." She gave a faint, regretful smile. "I hoped the same thing." The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not empty, not hostile. Simply honest. After dinner, they walked outside. The evening air was warm. Downtown Columbus bustled with commuters heading home. They walked without destination for several blocks. Eventually, they reached a small riverside park. Families played nearby. Cyclists passed along the trail. The city lights reflected across the water. Sean rested one hand on the railing overlooking the river. "This place reminds me of our first apartment." Cora smiled. "You mean because we couldn't afford restaurants?" Sean laughed. "We thought takeout pizza beside the river counted as fine dining." It did. They both laughed quietly. For a moment, 15 years seemed much closer than 5 days. Then Cora became serious again. "I've been thinking about the divorce." Sean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a father teaching his young daughter how to skip stones across the water. Finally, he spoke. "So have I." She turned toward him. "When I handed you those papers," her voice caught slightly. I believed our marriage had already ended." Sean nodded once. "I know." "I don't know that anymore." He remained quiet. She continued. "I can't erase what I said." No?" "I can't erase what I believed." "No." She looked directly at him. "But I can tell you the truth." Sean waited. "I wasn't leaving because you were a facilities manager." He listened carefully. "I was leaving because I thought we'd stopped growing together." Sean considered her words. Inside, he realized they carried more honesty than many conversations they had shared during the previous several years. He answered just as honestly. "I think we both stopped inviting each other into our worlds." She nodded slowly. "You protected yours. And you built yours. Until they barely touched." "Yes." Neither blamed the other. Neither pretended the problems had appeared overnight. Their marriage hadn't been damaged by one dinner. It had drifted through hundreds of small moments they never addressed. Cora reached into her purse. Sean immediately recognized the envelope. The divorce papers. She looked at them for several seconds. Then she placed them on the railing between them. "I haven't signed them." Sean looked at the papers. "Neither have I." She took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight." He appreciated that. "I'm asking for a chance." Sean remained thoughtful. A chance, not a promise. Not forgiveness, not an immediate reconciliation, simply a chance. He looked out across the river again. Inside, his thoughts settled carefully. He still cared about Cora. That truth had never disappeared. But affection alone could not repair broken trust. Real change required time, consistency, honesty. He turned back toward her. "I don't know what our future looks like." She nodded. "I understand. But I do know this." He gently picked up the envelope. "We shouldn't make permanent decisions while we're still discovering the truth about ourselves." Cora felt tears form in her eyes. Not because everything had been fixed. Because for the first time in a long time, neither of them was trying to win an argument. They were trying to understand one another. Sean folded the envelope once and placed it inside his jacket. "We'll wait." She quietly exhaled. "Thank you." As they continued walking beside the river, both understood that the hardest part of rebuilding a marriage wasn't saying, "I'm sorry." It was proving day after day that the people speaking those words were willing to become better than they had been before. Their future remained uncertain. But for the first time since the anniversary, dinner uncertainty no longer felt like the end. It felt like the possibility of a new beginning. 6 months later, spring sunlight filled the courtyard outside Sterling Urban Development's newly renovated community training center. Rows of white chairs faced a small stage decorated with simple blue and silver banners. The event was not celebrating a corporate acquisition. It was celebrating opportunity. The first class of Sterling Future Leaders Scholars had arrived. Students from across Ohio stood with their families, proudly wearing name badges instead of business suits. Some planned to study engineering. Others had chosen architecture, environmental science construction management, or skilled trades. Many were the first in their families to attend college. Inside the audience sat Sterling employees, local educators, community leaders, and scholarship recipients. Sean stood near the side of the stage rather than behind it. He had insisted that the students remain the center of attention. Richard Lawson walked over with a smile. "I've been attending corporate events for nearly 30 years. Sean looked toward the students, laughing together. "This doesn't feel like one." Richard nodded. "That's exactly why I like it." Nearby, Nathan Holloway greeted project managers from several regional offices. Emma Collins spoke with representatives from 2 nonprofit organizations partnering with the scholarship program. Grace Mitchell chatted with interns who would begin work at Sterling during the summer. The atmosphere felt optimistic. Not because every problem had disappeared, because people could finally see a direction worth following. A staff member approached Sean. "They're ready?" Sean nodded. "Let's begin." Richard welcomed everyone to the ceremony before introducing the students. Instead of announcing scholarship amounts, he shared their ambitions. Future bridge engineer, future architect, future electrician, future environmental planner. Each introduction received enthusiastic applause. Then Richard invited Sean to the podium. Sean stood before the audience for several quiet seconds. He looked at the students, then at their parents, finally at the employees filling the back rows. "Good afternoon." His familiar, calm voice settled over the gathering. "When I was young, my grandfather taught me something I'll never forget." He paused. "He said every building tells 2 stories." The audience listened closely. Then Tunpreet. "The first story is about concrete, steel, and glass." A few students smiled. "The second story is about the people whose lives become better because that building exists." Sean looked toward the scholarship recipients. "I've spent most of my career investing in buildings." He smiled gently. "Today we're investing in people." The audience applauded warmly. Sean continued, "Every one of you receiving a scholarship today earned this opportunity." He deliberately emphasized the word earned. It wasn't given because of where you were born. It wasn't given because of who your parents know. It was earned through hard work, determination, and character. Several parents quietly wiped away tears. Sean's voice remained steady. "My hope isn't simply that you'll become successful." He looked across the students. "My hope is that one day when someone else needs an opportunity," he paused, "you'll remember this moment, and you'll choose to create one." The applause that followed lasted much longer than expected. Sean thanked the audience before stepping away from the microphone. As promised, the spotlight returned to the students. Later that afternoon, the ceremony concluded. Families gathered for photographs. Employees volunteered as mentors. Students toured the training center where they would complete internships during the summer. Sean quietly walked through the courtyard, greeting families. One young scholarship recipient approached him nervously. "My name's Ethan." Sean smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Ethan." "I wanted to say thank you." Sean shook his head gently. "You earned your place here." The young man smiled. "I still wanted to thank you." Sean extended his hand. "I'm glad you're here." Ethan shook it proudly before hurrying back to his parents. Richard watched the exchange from nearby. "You never let anyone thank you for too long." Sean smiled. "I'd rather they focus on what comes next." Richard laughed softly. "I know." Across the courtyard, Cora stood speaking with several scholarship recipients interested in commercial development. Over the previous 6 months, she had remained with Sterling. Not because she was married to Sean, because she had earned the trust of both the new leadership team and her colleagues. She had volunteered to mentor several young professionals entering the company. Watching her now, Sean noticed something different. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions instead of giving immediate answers. She had changed. Not overnight, not perfectly, but genuinely. Their marriage had changed as well. The divorce papers remained unsigned. They had chosen counseling, long conversations, honest disagreements, shared dinners, weekend walks. Progress came slowly, exactly as trust often does. Some days felt easy. Others reminded them how much work remained. Neither expected quick solutions anymore. They expected consistency. That expectation proved far healthier. As the afternoon came to an end, Cora walked over. "The students are incredible." Sean nodded. "They are." She looked around the courtyard. "You were right." He smiled. "About what?" "Success should create opportunity." Sean looked toward the scholarship recipients laughing together. "I learned that from someone wiser than me, your grandfather." He nodded. For a moment they simply watched the families celebrating. Cora quietly reached for Sean's hand. This time she didn't wonder who he was. She knew. Not because of his wealth, not because he owned Argent Crest, but because over the previous 6 months she had finally taken the time to understand the values that had guided him all along. Sean gently squeezed her hand. Inside, he knew the future still held uncertainty. Businesses would face challenges. People would make mistakes. Relationships would require continued effort. But he also knew something else. The strongest foundations were rarely built quickly. They were built carefully. One honest decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of integrity at a time. As the sun began to set over Columbus, the scholarship recipients gathered for one final group photograph. Sean and Cora stood quietly at the edge of the crowd rather than in the center. The picture wasn't about them. It never had been. The camera flashed. Dozens of young faces smiled toward the future. Sean smiled too. Not because he had won. Not because he had been proven right. But because he had discovered that the greatest measure of success was never the title on an office door. It was the number of lives made better after that door had opened. Every great story reminds us that the biggest battles are rarely fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. They are fought within our own hearts. Sean's journey teaches us that true success isn't measured by wealth status or the title printed on a business card. It's measured by integrity when no one is watching, humility when everyone is applauding, and kindness when you have every reason to choose otherwise. Cora's journey reminds us that people can lose sight of what truly matters when they begin comparing appearances instead of appreciating character. Yet it also shows that growth is always possible when we are willing to admit our mistakes, listen with an open heart, and choose honesty over pride. In the end, the greatest victories were never the acquisition of a company or the exposure of corruption. They were the rebuilding of trust, the creation of opportunities for others, and the decision to leave the world a little better than it was before. Remember, your legacy will never be defined by what you own, but by the lives you touch, the promises you keep, and the example you leave behind. Every choice you make today is laying the foundation for the person you will become tomorrow. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What lesson touched your heart the most, and what would you have done if you were in Sean or Cora's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy powerful stories about resilience, justice, love, and second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next inspiring story. Thank you for watching.